New South Wales, Australia. Stunning coastlines, national parks, rolling hills, a dream destination for tourists, backpackers, and anyone chasing the perfect escape into nature. But hidden beneath the beauty of this coastal paradise is a horror story that still haunts Australia to this day. Over a 2-year span, this breathtaking stretch of wilderness became the hunting ground for one of Australia's most twisted killers. Young travelers vanished without a trace. Then, one by one, their bodies were discovered. Stabbed, shot, beaten, decapitated. The press called them the backpack murders, and for years no one knew who was behind them, or if he was working alone. But what they did know was that these were some of the most brutal and twisted murders in Australia's history. This case takes us back to the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, a time before smartphones, social media, and just constant connection. Back when backpacking through a foreign country felt like a rite of passage, not a death sentence. So today we are diving into the backpack murders, how it began, how it spiraled, and the chilling truth about who was really behind it. Did he truly act alone, or was something even darker hiding in the Belangelo forest? Hey guys, I'm Annie Elise, this is 10 to Life, and let's jump right in. If you can find Sydney on a map, then you've already found New South Wales. Sydney's the state capital. So sitting on Australia's east coast, the area is known for its beautiful beaches, its booming tourism, and these just like endless national parks that attract nature lovers from all over the world. Now, September 19th, 1992 was the start of spring in Australia, because remember, the southern hemisphere has opposite seasons from ours. The weather was now just warming up, and because of that, everybody wanted to be outside, including 2 runners whose identities have never been released to the public. And once you hear what they stumbled upon, you will understand why. They decided to go run at a place called Belangelo State Forest. It was open to the public, full of hiking and running trails. But the thing was, they didn't make it very far because they ended up stumbling across something that would haunt them forever. On the ground, almost completely concealed by, plant life, were what looked to be human remains. The runners immediately called the police and told them about their discovery. They then arrived on the scene and confirmed what they feared. The remains were in fact human. Someone had died out there, and their body was decomposing right there on the running trail. And only about 100 feet away, officers found a second body. The 2 deceased people were 21-year-old Caroline Clark and 22-year-old Joanne Walters. Both women were British backpackers who had been reported missing in April of that year. The police had been investigating their disappearance ever since then, but the case had been pretty much cold since day one. Joanne and Caroline's relatives told detectives that the last time that they had heard from either woman, they had been planning to hitchhike from Sydney to the western side of Australia. Which you might be thinking, okay, well, they were backpackers. That makes sense that they were hitchhiking. And their bodies were found in the woods. So maybe they just wandered off the trail. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they tragically died in some kind of hiking accident. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but it does happen. Except when Caroline and Joanne's autopsy results came in, it was immediately clear this was no accident. Both women had been brutally beaten before they died. And whatever did this, or whoever did this, definitely was not a wild animal. There were signs that Joanne had been gagged and sexually assaulted. This before her killer then stabbed her 14 times, 9 times in the back and 5 times to the chest. He slashed Joanne so many times that he left her shirt absolutely shredded. The coroner believed that one of those 9 stab wounds to her back had hit her spinal cord, ultimately paralyzing her, which is terrible. I don't want to make it sound like that was a good thing at all, but the silver lining was that she was probably completely numb when the killer fatally stabbed her in the chest. She was potentially spared what could have been a much more painful death, and although she had to experience the gagging, the sexual assault, and the other gruesome things, I just hope that by being paralyzed, she didn't feel any internal physical pain, although I would imagine the mental fear was just overwhelming. Now, as for Caroline, she most likely died second, and the theory is that the killer tied her up and forced her to watch him assault and then murder Joanne, which that must have been so terrifying for her to watch her friend die in such a horrible way, all while realizing, too, that she was most likely in for the exact same fate. Then, once he was done with Joanne, he moved on over to Caroline. And the investigators believe that she was, quote, marched over to where her body was ultimately found. And I don't know why he wouldn't just kill them in the same spot. Maybe he enjoyed the power, the control, the fear of it all, of saying, walk this direction, something like that. But I don't know, could be some sort of mental manipulation, I'm not sure. But he marched her over to this spot, and then the killer shot her 10 times. 10 times directly in the back of the head. Now, when Oxygen covered this case, they described her gunshot wounds in a way that kind of gets under my skin, if I'm being honest with you. Maybe it'll stick with you too, let me know. But they said that it was, quote, as though she had been used for target practice. Which I don't think I even need to say that these murders were absolutely horrific, right? And to make things even more disturbing, Caroline and Joanne had been very well liked. They didn't have any enemies. There were no obsessive exes, nothing that would indicate this was retaliation or targeted, nothing. So because of that, there were no obvious suspects. So of course, once their deaths made the news, everybody was wondering who might be next, who could possibly be doing this, whether it was possible for anybody to be safe so long as a murderer was out on the loose. And one of the big rumors that started going around almost immediately was that Caroline and Joanne had been killed by a serial killer. And it made a certain amount of sense, right? I mean, 2 brutal murders with no obvious motive. How else do you explain it? Well, the police did everything that they could to shut down that kind of gossip right away. Every time they talked with a journalist or gave a press conference, they were very clear that while they didn't know who exactly actually killed these 2 women, there was definitely no reason to think that it was a serial killer. Now, of course, the issue was that even while the police were saying it wasn't a serial killer, they also weren't saying who it actually was. They didn't give a person of interest, a suspect, nothing really, not anything. Now, at one point, the officers worked with a fairly famous criminal profiler named Dr. Rod Milton. He studied the crime scene, he came up with a profile for the killer, but it was all pretty vague. So much so, in fact, that it was so vague his findings were basically useless. Now, what he did claim was that the killer was a man in his mid-30s, that he likely lived outside of the city, that he was probably in a pretty remote area, probably had a job that involved working outdoors, and at some point he had been in a messy relationship with a woman. He probably also had a history of aggression toward the police. So like I said, pretty vague, right? I mean, in other words, he could have lived just about anywhere. He had a messy relationship with a woman at some point, which, let's be honest, who hasn't been through a bad breakup or fought with a friend or had a messy relationship, right? Even a female family member maybe at some point. The idea that he also had an outdoor job and a history of aggression, I mean, it narrowed it down a little bit, but it really wasn't the most helpful profile by any means. Felt pretty generic. So, I mean, the police had almost nothing to go by. So a full year went by without any new breaks, zero progress. But then, in October of 1993, a different man was in that same state forest, just looking for branches, looking for logs that he could take home with him to use as firewood. And what happened next felt eerily familiar, almost like a chilling repeat of the Caroline and Joanne discovery, because he also accidentally stumbled upon human remains. But this time, he saw 2 bodies right away. It didn't take the police coming to find the second body. So he immediately called the police. They arrived quickly, secured the area, and of course launched a full investigation. And they identified the deceased as a man and a woman who had been dating one another. Their names were Deborah Everest and James Gibson. They were both young too, only 19 years old. And they had been missing for quite some time by that point, since late December of 1989 to be exact. So it had almost been 4 years at this point. Before their disappearance, they had been planning on going to something called Confest, which was in Sydney. And apparently this is like some sort of, I don't know, gathering, but to get there, the plan was to hitchhike there. And hitchhiking, too, was very big in the 80s. I know my dad, personally, he grew up in Ohio. He hitchhiked all the way to California. That was more the 70s, I guess, but still, you get my point. So Deborah had told her mother that she would be back home in 2 days. But of course, she never made it home. Not after 2 days, and not ever. And the moment that her mom realized that something was wrong, she reported Deborah as missing. After that, the police got a few tips, but nothing major enough to lead investigators to them. One stranger did find James's camera on New Year's Eve in 1989. It was just lying on the side of the road in Sydney. Then, a few months later in March, on that same road, another random person found his backpack. That road was about 75 miles away from the state forest, give or take, and that's ultimately where the bodies were found. So 75 miles, that's pretty far away, right? Now, does that mean that they were ditching things along the way and then their bodies were ultimately moved 75 miles away? Does it mean that whoever the serial killer is kept them alive on this journey all the way to the state forest and they intentionally dropped things along the way, or maybe he disposed of them? I don't know, but a 75-mile spread over the course of 4 years, that's pretty big, right? And sadly, James and Deborah had also been killed in just an absolutely brutal way. Once again, it felt like an eerie repeat of Caroline and Joanne's murders. Deborah had been violently beaten, literally to the point of death. Her skull showed at least 2 severe fractures and her jaw was completely broken. And one source I saw said that she had at least 1 stab wound on her back and knife marks on her face, which I'm assuming that it means that they were fairly shallow cuts rather than fatal stab wounds, but I'm not sure. Like I said, though, that was just one source, so take all of those details with a grain of salt. Now, James, on the other hand, he was found in the fetal position. He had multiple stab wounds in the back and in his chest, but the reports are pretty inconsistent about how many stab wounds there truly were. One of the stab wounds on his back, though, was deep enough to sever his spinal cord. But ultimately, the ones that killed him were the slashes to the heart, liver, and lungs. So now, with 4 bodies found in the same remote forest, all killed in a very disturbingly similar way, the police were finally forced to consider what they had been denying all along. Could this be the work of a serial killer? The local police set up a task force to explore the exact possibility of that. And it had over 20 different specialists to gather evidence, to analyze it, and to try and find the real killer. In the meantime, the local police were warning the locals that hitchhiking was potentially very dangerous right now, especially given that there might have been a serial killer on the loose, right? The officers were saying that people should avoid hitchhiking anywhere, but especially along the Hume Highway. Now, this particular highway is a pretty busy road that connected Sydney to Melbourne, and during this time in particular, it was like hitchhiker heaven. People weren't scared to give you a ride. Chances were they were all going in the same direction anyway. It was just very common. Now, this highway is also very close to the state forest, which is why they believed that whoever was doing this likely found their victims on the highway, then made them feel comfortable that they would give them a ride, but instead drove them directly to their death in the forest. Chances are, too, that if they were hitchhiking, they probably weren't from the area, and they wouldn't get suspicious or really know what was going on until the very last second. They wouldn't understand the misdirection. And it's so crazy how normalized hitchhiking was when you really sit back and think about every possibility of everything that could go wrong. Just anybody who has sinister intentions, that would truly be like a predator's playground. Now, the police also warned that some people might think that they would be safe if they used the buddy system. If you're hitchhiking with a friend or you have multiple friends, then you're less likely to be attacked by a stranger than if you're on your own. But that clearly was not the case here, because Caroline and Joanne, they were together when they died. So were Deborah and James. So now the messaging was, be safe and just don't hitchhike, period, even with a friend. Be careful anytime you're even close to the woods, too. In spite of those warnings, though, on November 1st, 1993, just weeks after Deborah and James's bodies had been found, they found another body. Now, unlike the other victims, this person was found all alone, not with a friend and not with a travel buddy. Her name was Simone Schmidl, and she was only 21 years old. She had been missing since January 20th, 1991. She was a tourist from Germany who was exploring Australia for the very first time. And since she was alone, she checked in with her friends and family all the time. She was always calling them, always saying what she had done that day, what she was planning on doing next, where she was going to be. Share all of the things that you need to share so that somebody can keep tabs on you from afar. But get this, the police believed that right before she had gone missing, she had been trying to hitchhike along that highway. And now here she was, dead with at least 8 stab wounds on her body. 2 were on her back and had, very similarly, severed her spine, but the fatal stab wounds were ones that hit her organs. And even though Simone was different from the other victims because she was alone, everything else about this murder was exactly the same. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the victims were paralyzed before their deaths. Pretty consistently, too. The killer hit, stabbed, and severed their spinal cords before ultimately delivering the fatal stab wounds. And it happened often enough that it almost seemed like it was intentional, like it wasn't an accident from going too deep with the knife. Like maybe the killer was doing all of this on purpose. Now, there was one other really interesting detail about Simone's crime scene. There were some clothes on the ground next to her body, and these clothes were not hers. But since she had been traveling alone, it's not like she had any reason to be carrying somebody else's outfit with her. It really just did not make much sense. But the police found themselves having to wonder if maybe the killer had been sloppy or bold enough to leave their own clothing behind at the crime scene, hoping it would be found, or leaving some kind of calling card situation. The other possibility, of course, though, was that maybe there was a second body nearby after all, and that maybe it just hadn't been found yet. Maybe the killer had attacked someone else along with Simone, then taken their bag and left their stuff with her. So, the police scoured the area, combing through the bushes, the grass, everything with a fine-toothed comb, searching for more victims. It took 3 days, but eventually, police uncovered 2 more bodies. Now, identifying them took even longer, but they were ultimately confirmed to be 21-year-old Gabor Neugebauer and 20-year-old Anja Habshade. They were 2 German tourists who had come to Australia to backpack and sightsee. And just like all of the other victims, they had been missing for a while. And also, just like so many of the others, their last known location was that big highway. They too had been hitchhiking. They were officially reported missing the day after Christmas in 1991. And here's another similarity that they had to most of the other victims. The police investigated their disappearances for a while, but the case went cold almost immediately. Now, Gabor hadn't been stabbed. Instead, he was shot 6 times in the back of the head. And when I was researching this case, some of my sources said that he was also strangled, while others just said that he may have been strangled. Now, Gabor's death was awful, don't get me wrong, they all were. But there was something about Anja's death that set her apart. For one, her body was found nude. The killer had removed her clothing, and that was in fact the outfit that was found near Simone's body. But even more disturbing, Anja was missing something else entirely. Her head. She had been decapitated. And what makes it even more unsettling is that her skull has still never been found. Investigators searched the area extensively, combing through the woods, looking everywhere, but it's like it just vanished. Or was it taken as a trophy? And other than those details, everything about her case was very similar to all of the others. It was pretty clear that this was the same killer, and he had or she had the same MO. But cutting someone's head off when they've never done it before, and as like the first time they're doing that in this mass murder spree, it felt like there must have been some significance there. Like maybe the murderer was escalating. Maybe it was personal. Maybe it suggested some kind of connection between the killer and Anja. Now, I don't know exactly what it meant, but the police were definitely treating this decapitation as a major clue. I'll also note that the police never released Anja's exact cause of death. Some of the earlier victims had been stabbed and some were shot, and the reports said that her murder was consistent with the previous ones, but they never specified which ones it was consistent with, if it was a stabbing or a shooting. Now at this point, police were still piecing together the killer's methods, trying to understand both how he was killing and who he was targeting. Now, what they did know was that all of the victims were young backpackers, most of them between the ages of 19 and 21, and they had all last been seen along that highway. Based on the shell casings that were found at Caroline and Joanne's crime scene, the investigators believed that the killer was using a .22 caliber pistol, likely the same weapon in each of the shootings. But beyond that, they had no suspect, no person of interest, no idea who this person really was. They were desperate for answers. And then, just when it felt like the trail had gone cold, someone called in with a story that would change everything. On November 9th, 1993, a woman called the tip hotline with a very interesting story. She said her name was Joanne Barry, and that in 1990, she had basically rescued a hitchhiker from being murdered. According to Joanne, it happened in January of that year. She was driving alone along the highway, and she noticed an SUV that was parked off to the side of the road. Now, at first, it looked like maybe somebody had pulled over because of car trouble. But then, out of nowhere, a man came sprinting toward her car, waving his arms, yelling for help. And right behind him, another man was chasing after him. It all happened so fast, but Joanne heard the man yelling, help me, he's got a gun." And that was really all she needed to hear and see. I mean, she pulled over, let him jump inside her car, and she just sped off, getting both of them the hell out of there before this other man could catch up with them. And naturally, when you pick up a stranger who has just escaped a potential murder, there's not really a smooth way to start that conversation, right? It's not the kind of situation where you make some sort of small talk. You ask them, like, what's going on? Are you okay? And Joanne asked this guy for his name, to which he responded that his name was Paul Onions, that he was an English tourist who had come to Australia thinking that it was a safe place to hike, explore trails, and hitchhike. Now, obviously, he was now coming to realize none of that was true, right? So anyway, Joanne drove him to the nearest police station so that he could file a report on everything that had happened. But after that, she never saw or heard from him ever again. Now, here's the problem. When Paul gave his statement, the police treated the whole thing like it was no big deal, like he was overreacting or maybe even misreading the situation. An officer took a few notes here and there while Paul talked, but as for an actual report, no. By 1993, when Joanne Barry called in her tip, there was no record of this whole situation ever happening. Either the report was never officially filed, or it had somehow been lost along the way, which, I mean, talk about a real up, right? Not only had the officers lost important key information about this possible serial killer, but the investigating officers who were looking into it now didn't even have Paul's contact information. They didn't know how to find him, how to get his statement, how to talk to him. And even if they did track him down, I mean, his memories certainly weren't as fresh anymore, right? Now, the good news was that a few days after this tip went, basically nowhere, another person called them. And sure enough, call it serendipitous, call it whatever you want, divine intervention, this person was none other than Paul himself. He told the detectives that he had been traveling through Australia between December of 1989 and June of 1990. He had been hitchhiking when one day a man had pulled over and offered to give him a ride in his car. The man was in a white Toyota Land Cruiser, and it had seat covers on it that Paul described as being woolly. Unfortunately, though, Paul didn't get a look at the license plate number before climbing inside. The driver apparently introduced himself as Bill and seemed nice enough. He also looked like he was maybe in his early 40s, and Paul could tell that he was very fit, like he worked out a lot. Paul said that he was about 5'10", give or take, that he had black hair, a black mustache to match, and again, was just in shape and tall. And at first, everything seemed totally normal. The guy who called himself Bill was friendly. There were no red flags. He and Paul chatted for a bit. Paul told him where he was headed, where he wanted to be dropped off, all the usual stuff that you would talk about when hitchhiking. And they had been driving for about an hour. And still, nothing felt off. No weird vibes, no tension. Paul was just kind of gazing out the window, taking in all of the scenery, until suddenly everything changed. Bill pulled off to the side of the road, and then, out of nowhere, he reached down and he pulled out a black revolver. It was almost like flipping a switch. One minute, it was a peaceful ride through the countryside. Then the next, it was a life or death situation. And Paul hadn't said or done anything to set him off. So the second that Paul saw the gun, he knew he had to run. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't hesitate. He just flung the door open and bolted, just praying the entire time that he would not get shot in the back. Now, assuming that Bill was the same person who killed all of the other hikers, Paul probably didn't need to worry about being shot right then and there, because, as we know, the killer liked to toy with his victims, take his time, and now Paul had just thrown a complete wrench in that plan. So luckily, he didn't get shot, and even luckier, Joanne happened to be driving by at that exact moment. She pulled over, got him in the car, and, well, the rest you already know, took off. Now, on one hand, it is so enraging that the police didn't take Paul more seriously when he made that report, right? If they had been able to find and arrest Bill back in 1990, they could have saved many of the victims who were killed after Paul's encounter with him. Simone went missing in 91. Gabor and Anya also in 91. Caroline and Joanne in 92. So, you see where I'm going with this, right? And those are just the victims that we know about right now, right? Who knows how many others might be out there who have never been found. But now, thanks to Paul calling back in, the police finally had something to work with. And the tips, they were just getting started. 2 other women came forward, calling in separately, but it turned out that they knew each other, and they had witnessed the same thing on the same night. So, 2 independent eyewitnesses giving the same account. Their real names were never released to the public, but the press refers to them as Mary and Therese. So because of that, that's what I'm going to call them too. Now we're going to flash back to 1977 just for a second here. Both girls had just turned 18. They were out looking for an adventure. They were tourists from Canberra, hitchhiking out of Liverpool, and wouldn't you know it, they were specifically hitchhiking along that same highway while they explored the country. And along the way, a man pulled over to offer them a ride. He never gave his name, but they described him as being in his early 30s with scraggly black hair. And that description pretty much matched exactly what Paul had told the police. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, just like it had with Paul. No red flags, no sense of danger. They made a quick pit stop for gas, but then got right back into the car and continued on the road. Except then, without a single word of explanation, the driver put on his turn signal and he pulled off the highway. And this was nowhere near the area where Therese and Mary had asked it to be dropped off. So they were a little weirded out by this, and they straight up asked him something like, "Hey, dude, where are we going?" His answer was just very casual. He said he needed to use the bathroom, so he was pulling off on the side of the road. He hadn't thought to do it while they were getting gas, but now he had to go, and he realized he couldn't wait much longer, so no big deal. So it wasn't until he turned off onto some random dirt road that the girls really began to panic. Because it's one thing to want to get off a main major road and maybe find a bush to pee behind in peace, but you don't need to go anywhere this remote. Clearly, he had other intentions in mind, which were much darker than just going to the bathroom on the side of the road. So by this point, the women were panicking. They were on high alert, just looking for a way out. Then, once the man was on this private dirt road, he parked the car, grabbed Mary by the arm, and said, "Okay, girls, who's first?" Which, that would be the most scary, haunting thing to ever happen. You pull off on this abandoned dirt road, you're with your friend, and he grabs one of you by the arm saying, "All right, which one of you is first?" The wheels would be spinning. What's happening? What's he going to do to us? You know it's not good, right? You want to protect your friend. You want to protect yourself. It's just such a scary situation to be in. So Mary and Therese saw this as a sign that they needed to fight as hard and as viciously as they could. Mary punched the man straight in the face, and she hit him hard enough that she ended up buying herself and Therese a few seconds to run away. They ran away and they hid behind a bush. And luckily, the guy didn't see where they went. He did look for them though, and not just for a few minutes either, but for hours, just walking around trying to find them, almost like it's a game of twisted hide and seek. Maybe he was getting off on that because he was a predator and they were his prey. But again, imagine the fear. Imagine like hiding behind a bush, hoping he doesn't spot you, just trying to be quiet, trying to hope an animal doesn't come up to you, trying to make sure you don't hit a stick the wrong way to where it causes noise. I mean, for hours. So the whole time, Mary and Therese stayed exactly where they were, too afraid to breathe too hard or cough or do anything that might draw his attention. I mean, imagine just holding still, terrified for your life for literal hours. Finally, he seemed to give up and leave. But even once it looked like he was gone, Therese and Mary just stayed where they were hiding. They didn't want to risk that he was trying to trick them and, waiting just out of sight for them to then emerge from their hiding place and then pounce on them. Eventually, though, the girls either decided it was safe to leave or they were too exhausted to stay where they were. So they got up, they looked up and down the dirt road to see if there was anywhere safe that they could get, and they were on the move. In the distance, they saw a farmhouse that looked very welcoming, so they went up to it, knocked on the door, and explained everything to the people who lived there. Then, those people offered to take them to the police station so they could file a report. But for whatever reason, Mary and Therese decided not to go to the police back then. They haven't publicly spoken about why they made that decision, but I can speculate that maybe they were afraid that nobody would believe them. Now, though, fast forward, they were willing to talk. So they called the police with this tip line, right? And they told the police everything. And it's not hard to notice how similar their story was to Paul's story. The girls didn't know the driver's name, and Paul, remember, said that it was somebody named Bill. But the officer suspected that the driver had, of course, given Paul a fake name, that he didn't actually go by Bill. Still, they went through all their files of people with past records or even people who had been suspects in earlier crimes but not convicted, just to see if they could get a hit. Their thinking was that this serial killer probably didn't just start committing murders out of the blue. He probably had other crimes in his past and had worked his way up the ladder to now being a serial killer. So the goal was to compare existing mugshots to the description that Paul, Mary, and Therese had given, hoping to see that maybe somebody would match the killer's description. Then they gathered all of the photos that looked like the best fit, the likeliest of suspects, and some police officers asked Paul to come to the station, to sit down and look at all of these photos, see if he recognized any of them as the man who had attacked him, Bill. And there was one person that Paul immediately honed in on, a man named Ivan Melat. Now, this wasn't exactly a shock. The police had actually pulled Ivan's photo because he matched Paul's description to a T, and he had a criminal history. Which, get this, he had been accused of sexually assaulting and kidnapping 2 female backpackers who were hitchhiking back in 1971. He actually ended up getting charged with the crime too, but for whatever reason, he wasn't found guilty. Now, of course, without a conviction, no one could say for sure if he really had attacked those 2 backpackers. But he also had a connection to the areas where each of the victims were found. He was a construction worker who did road repairs, meaning he had to travel up and down the highway all the time during the time when this serial killer was active there. In fact, when the police spoke with his supervisors, they discovered that he had the day off every single time one of the victims went missing and was then later found murdered. So in other words, he had the means, he had the opportunity, and it appears he must have had the motive from previous allegations every single time. He also owned a .22 caliber firearm, the exact type of gun that was used to kill Caroline and Joanne, which, remember, was confirmed by the shell casings that had been recovered at the scene. And as if that weren't enough, he matched the profiler's description of the killer almost perfectly. He lived in a semi-rural area just outside of a major city, Sydney in his case. He had a documented history of violence, and although it's less talked about, there also were rumors that he wasn't exactly an ideal partner, suggesting a very rocky or even abusive relationship history with women. So that box also checked off. The only thing that really was slightly off was the age range, because Dr. Milton guessed him to be in his early 30s, and he was actually a little bit older, but still not too far off. Now, the only problem was that all of this evidence was circumstantial. I mean, yes, Ivan had the right profile, the right appearance, the right job, he owned the right gun, and I could go on and on. But technically, there could have been someone else out there who also owned a .22 caliber gun, who had a connection to that highway, who was in their 30s or early 40s. I mean, you get what I'm saying, right? The investigators were confident that Ivan was their guy, but they needed more hard evidence to seal the deal. So they looked at Ivan's vehicle registration information. They wanted to see if he had ever owned an SUV, the one that fit Paul's statement. But instead, they found that around the time that Caroline and Joanne's bodies were found, back in 1992, Ivan had owned a silver Nissan Patrol. Then, 2 months after the women's murders, Ivan sold it. And right after the new owners got it, they decided they wanted to clean it top to bottom, get it to look like, a newish car. And that's when they saw something very interesting. Under one of the seats was a .22 caliber shell casing. Eventually, those owners got in touch with the police, who analyzed the shell casing, and they found that it was identical to the one that they had found at Caroline and Joanne's crime scene. So finally, a smoking gun, and that was enough for the police to arrest Ivan on May 22nd, 1994. The police showed up bright and early at his house for this arrest around 6:36 a.m. And instead of knocking on his door, they called him on his phone. When he eventually answered, the investigators explained who they were, said that they were outside of his home, and that he and his girlfriend, who was also inside, needed to come out right away and surrender to the police. Which, just to be clear, they didn't believe that the girlfriend was involved in any way, shape, or form, but still, they needed her to come out of the house for safety reasons, right? Now, Ivan didn't say much on the phone. He just mumbled something under his breath and hung up. And the next few minutes felt like hours, because get this, nothing happened. Everything was quiet. Ivan didn't come out, neither did his girlfriend, and the investigators were starting to get a really eerie feeling about it. They didn't want to just break down the door and storm in, because what if he was standing on the other side of the door with a loaded gun? Or what if he took his girlfriend hostage? Again, they wanted to be safe. They didn't want anybody to get hurt. And they weren't sure what they were really supposed to do next. So they called Ivan's phone again. And he answered again. Now, I haven't been able to find any reports on what exactly they said on the phone, but whatever it was, apparently the police were persuasive, because after a few more minutes, both Ivan and his girlfriend came outside. They surrendered peacefully without any more issues. And then the officers went inside and searched Ivan's home. And what they found was nothing short of a jackpot when it came to evidence. Because it turns out, Ivan did like to keep trophies. In one of the bedrooms, investigators discovered 2 sleeping bags that were stuffed into the bottom of a drawer. Those sleeping bags had once belonged to 2 of this serial killer's victims. And in Ivan's bedroom, they found a framed picture of his girlfriend wearing what looked to be one of Caroline Clark's missing shirts. They also found Caroline's camera. Some officers additionally found camping gear that had belonged to the German backpackers, but they didn't publicly say exactly what the gear was or where in the house they found it. They also found a lot of other equipment that they couldn't trace directly to any of the victims, but it was clear that Ivan was hoarding backpacking supplies. This included multiple tents, a lot of bills and coins from other countries, which Ivan had probably taken them from his international victims. And when you think about it, that means that he took his time digging through all of their things after he killed them, picking and choosing which souvenirs he wanted to hold on to. Now, once the search was done, Ivan actually tried to argue that all of that gear and all of that evidence had been planted in his house. He insisted he had never seen the tents, the money, or any of it ever before, which is pretty funny on the surface, but especially because given that one of the pieces of that evidence was a photo of his girlfriend in one of the victim's shirts. And these were the days, before Photoshop, before anything like that, so you've got to wonder, how would the police have planted a photograph of your girlfriend wearing one of the deceased victim's shirts? It makes no sense, but I get it. He was probably hoping for a Hail Mary. Now, in addition to the victim's belongings, investigators also found a stash of guns. One of them was a .22 caliber rifle, matching the shell casings that were found at Caroline and Joanne's crime scene, as well as ones that were found in the car that Ivan had sold. And get this, the police did not stop there. they decided to track down Ivan's relatives and search their homes too, just in case he tried to hide more evidence away from his own property. And sure enough, they hit the jackpot again. Investigators uncovered victims' belongings not just at his mother's house, but in 5 of his brother's homes as well. And the items were all eerily similar to what had been found at Ivan's place: foreign coins, clothing, tents, sleeping bags, all the kinds of things that a backpacker or hitchhiker might be carrying with them. So there was this theory floating around that Ivan might have had an accomplice in all of this. Now, whether that came from law enforcement or was just speculation, it's hard to say. But the fact that the investigators went out of their way to search his family members' homes does suggest that they had some kind of reason to suspect that more was going on. But aside from some of the victims' belongings, there really was never anything else to really prove that anybody else was involved. Sure, the items were in their homes, but Ivan could have given them to his family members as some sort of sick gift, right? Just like he must have given his girlfriend one of those shirts. I just truly don't know if I believe that Ivan, 5 of his brothers, and even his mom were all in on this greater, grander scheme. It seems a little bit like a stretch with no other information or evidence. So I think it's probably more just became some sort of local rumor or folklore almost, just kind of giving fuel to this scary story. Now, before I go on, I do want to talk a little bit about why people thought Ivan could have had an accomplice, especially in the first place, right? Because that might sound like a surprise. Because the survivors, Therese, Mary, and Paul, all said that Ivan was alone in the car when he picked them up. He didn't seem to be working with anyone, right? So if his brother or anyone else was involved with these murders, it either meant that their involvement was at some point other than after the hitchhikers were kidnapped, or that they were only helping out with some of the killings, which seems just too out of routine. However, a lot of the time, Ivan killed his victims in pairs. Joanne and Caroline together, Deborah and James together, and so on. So, in theory, one person with a gun or a knife could threaten 2 people long enough to restrain them and then kill them both. But it would be a lot easier to do if there was a second killer, or even a third or a fourth. Plus, there were cigarette butts found at one of the crime scenes, and Ivan didn't smoke. Now, the police figured that maybe one of the victims had left the cigarette butts behind, but I gotta say, I have a hard time imagining that when somebody is restrained or kidnapped or about to be murdered, that they want a cigarette break and that the serial killer allows them to have a cigarette break, especially after being abducted. It doesn't make sense because technically the cigarette could also become a weapon, right? They could take it and burn whomever. But aside from all of that, interestingly, the police also found strands of hair in one of the victims' hands. And the DNA did not match Ivan's. So all of this kind of led people to wonder if it was possible that either Ivan wasn't the real killer or there had been someone else at the scene of the crime and the victim had been trying to fight them off. And there's one more very interesting detail to consider as we explore whether Ivan truly acted alone or not. In 2005, his former attorney made a deathbed confession, claiming that Ivan's sister Shirley helped kill Joanne and Caroline. Now, based on everything we know, it makes more sense to me that Ivan acted alone. But you also have to admit that a deathbed confession is pretty wild. I mean, why lie at that point, right? Unless it wasn't a lie at all. Maybe he was feeling guilty. Maybe he was trying to unburden himself before he died. Who really knows? It's definitely a mystery, and I'm not even sure if the confession was ever taken seriously or if Shirley was ever actually investigated. Maybe she really did help him with the murder and got away with murder. I don't know. But that said, none of Ivan's siblings were ever arrested or convicted in connection with his crimes. And just to put that into perspective, he had a lot of siblings. 13 to be exact. His older brother Boris has been very vocal about how he does not support what Ivan did. But his siblings aren't all in agreement.
I basically feel in my own heart Ivan has betrayed the whole family. And thrown their whole names and every bit of reputation they got, he didn't care if he dragged it through the mud. And I feel like if my family got together and started washing that mud off, life would be better for them, their kids, and everyone around them. Head in the sand, trying to deny the obvious is just plain ridiculous. And not only that, it really can't settle well with their conscience. And my conscience clear. My conscience clear. I think it's time for them all to stand up and say, guilty as convicted. And I'm one person that does it. These people that are in denial of him really got to get their act together. They really do. I mean, to say, this is not just a murder. This is well above it. But I can tell you now, if this had happened to one of their kids, 1/10 of the evidence, they would accuse him straight away. They've got to really put the bigger picture on. And the bigger picture is 7 people lost their lives in a horrific, cold-blooded, terrifying. It's not as though you come and shut some guy walking down the street. This was terror.
I've never believed that Ivan had anything to do with this, right from the word go. When somebody's done some things like this, surely there must be some science. But Ivan has never been any different over the last 25, 30 years. I can never be 100% sure that Ivan never did this. The evidence is all circumstantial.
I suppose life would be easier if we could accept that he has been found guilty and has done this crime. But that is not the case. He's, in our eyes, he's not guilty of it. And until the day that we find different, we will support him.
Now, like I said, we still don't know whether Ivan acted alone or not. There's still a lot of debate and a lot of evidence that could go either way. We do know that on May 31st, 1994, Ivan was charged with the 7 backpacker murders. They also thought that he might have committed even more murders than those 7, but 7 is what the police were able to support with the evidence that they had. Ivan was also a suspect in the possible deaths of a 20-year-old named Leanne Goodall, who disappeared back in 1978, an 18-year-old Robin Hickey, who disappeared in 79, and a 14-year-old girl named Amanda Robinson, who also disappeared that same year in 79. All 3 women were also backpackers who all disappeared in that same area where Ivan was working. The issue is that their bodies haven't been found, so nobody could prove that they have been murdered, let alone that Ivan did it. So without a confession, there just isn't enough proof or evidence to say that Ivan is the one responsible. Ivan's trial began in 1996, and it lasted a very, very long, grueling 18 weeks. Which, just to level set, the Karen Reed trial that went on lasted 8 weeks, and that felt like forever. His lasted 18 weeks. 145 different people took the stand, including Ivan himself. But on July 27th, 1996, Ivan was found guilty of all 7 murders. But those 7 victims weren't the only ones who got justice that day, because Ivan was also found guilty of attempted murder, robbery, and false imprisonment for Paul. Which, full transparency, I'm not sure why Mary and Therese didn't have any charges filed on their behalf. Maybe it had to do with how long it took them to make their reports, or maybe they preferred to protect their privacy and not press any charges. I'm not really sure. But Ivan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 6 years for each of the charges related to Paul's attack. And he had his own thoughts on the verdict that he got.
You know, the final day of the trial, were you really confident that you'd be found innocent?
I was fairly confident going on the evidence. That's what I was going on. You know, the DNA and everything else. But I couldn't count on the judge.
What about the DNA?
Well, it wasn't mine, was it?
Yeah, well, I realise that, yeah.
And I thought the jury's got to see that.
After being found guilty, Ivan still claimed that he was innocent. And he gave a lot of interviews where he just kept claiming that he didn't know who the real killer was, and he had nothing whatsoever to do with any of the murders.
Have you ever been to Belanglo Forest?
Not so much. The only time I went there once with Ellie. You know, you go there, there's a shooting club down there. It's just a long straight old road. There's a road that goes off the highway. I know where it is because we worked on the highway all that along there, you know, big sign there.
And do you think that you know who may be responsible?
No, I got no idea. You know, I can think of all sorts of things, but no, not really.
Then in 2019, Ivan died in prison. Now, this wasn't a total surprise because in his final years, he was diagnosed with cancer and he was in and out of hospitals pretty regularly, and his health was failing. But before he passed, some investigators met with him and begged him to confess to any other murders that he might have committed. They wanted to be able to solve their open cases and bring peace to the victims' families. They also wanted to understand more about why he had done it. They were just asking for something, anything. And here is what he had to say.
You could put a blood torch to the ears or eye or whatever, then
You still can't help.
I can't help you.
Innocent till the very end, or selfish to the very end? Not giving those families answers or peace. What do you think? Needless to say, Ivan is very infamous in Australia. His crimes were so brutal, and it's incredibly upsetting that to this day, nobody knows his motives. It really did seem like he just committed these horrible, brutal crimes for no other reason than because he wanted to and had the thrill for it and had the opportunity. Ivan died without ever taking responsibility. No confession, no remorse, no closure for the families still left wondering if their loved ones were among his victims. And even now, decades later, one chilling question still lingers. Did Ivan act alone? Or is someone else still out there who got away with murder? Thank you so much for tuning in today for another episode. If you want to support the content and like the content that we deliver, make sure to hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss anything. I know this case was a lot to take in, and I really want to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think that Ivan acted alone? Do you think his sister did help? Do you think he had a motive? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments below. This is a twisty, turny one, and there are a lot of different opinions out there. So also maybe take a second, take the link to this video and share it with a friend or on your social media. And I'm curious to know, like, there is a lot of division out there. What do your friends think? What does your family think? I'm really curious to know where everybody sits. All right, thank you guys again so much, and until the next one, stay safe.